We now have our initial Jets 53-man roster for 2025, and the moves at wide receiver leave me both applauding and scratching my head. Locked On Jets begins now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, August 27th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Our episode today is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season is around the corner. Visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your future's bets now. On today's show, we're going to talk about the initial Jets 53-man roster. Cutdown day was yesterday, so we now have a first look at the 2025 New York Jets. We're going to talk about what I think the Jets did right, what I think the Jets did wrong, and some players who are now available, cut by other teams who should interest the New York Jets. Now, let's begin with the positive. And I want to preface this by saying the moves that were made yesterday probably are not going to be franchise-altering decisions one way or the other. In fact, the 53-man roster the Jets released yesterday is unlikely to be the 53-man roster the Jets have a week and a half from now when the regular season begins, because other teams cut players. The Jets will certainly be interested in those guys, and they will be able to upgrade at spots where they are weak. But I do have some thoughts on what the Jets did and what they did not do yesterday. So let's start with the positive. And for me, a positive is the Jets decided to move on from Malachi Corley, who was the top pick in the third round a year ago. Now, in many ways, this is a negative because you don't want to move on from the 65th pick in the draft after one season. But I think it's important to not get caught up in draft pedigree when you make roster decisions. And in many ways, this is an example of the saying, history does not repeat, but it rhymes. Because 6 years ago, the Jets had a new general manager who had just been hired, and he cut the final third-round pick of his predecessor after a very short Jets tenure. The GM 6 years ago was Joe Douglas, and the draft pick he cut was Jachai Polite, who was a rookie at that point. Mike McCagnon had just drafted him in the third round months earlier, and then the Jets made a GM change after the draft. Well, here we are 6 years later. Now Darren Mucci's the GM, and the third-round pick who got cut was drafted by Joe Douglas, Malachi Corley, after one season. It's easy to cut the previous guy's high pick. So I think the proof will be for Darren Mucci, whether he can do it with the guys he drafts and he realizes quickly that he made a mistake. But I think it was important for the Jets to not get caught up in Corley's draft pedigree. And something odd kind of happened yesterday after the Jets announced they were cutting Corley. Writer after writer, national, local, felt compelled to post on social media that Corley was quote unquote talented. And some people said he needed a change of scenery. Some people said, well, he's talented, but he's immature. And that's the reason the Jets cut him. And I have to question that. Now, Corley's talented from the standpoint that anybody who's in the NFL has talent. But it's very difficult to say that he was inordinately talented, because if that was true, he'd be on this team. This wide receiver room is not very good. And I have some issues with some of the moves the Jets made at wide receiver. We'll discuss a little bit later in the show. I don't see Corley do anything that an NFL wide receiver needs to do. He doesn't get good releases off the line of scrimmage. He doesn't run good routes. He's not particularly fast. He's not particularly elusive. He was a guy who more and more I feel like Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh fell in love with because they watched him run over tiny, small school cornerbacks and just got way too excited over that. I remember when the Jets drafted him a year ago, my hope was that Jeff Ulbrich, who was his coach at the Senior Bowl, had Corley run the route tree in Mobile and came away really impressed because Corley ran pretty much no routes in college. So the question was, would he be able to get up to speed really quickly? And my hope was that Ulbrich, who was his coach at the Senior Bowl, saw him make tremendous strides in just that 1 week and said, you know what, we can develop him. The other option was the Jets just got way too excited watching him run over small corners from small schools. And I think it was clearly the latter. And we had an early indication right after the Jets drafted Corley. They posted this video of social media of all the decision makers on the team calling him: Woody Johnson, Chris Johnson, Joe Douglas, Robert Saleh, Nathaniel Hackett, Sean Jefferson. They all talked about how great his film was. So I knew from that point going forward that this pick was probably in a lot of trouble. And in many ways, Corley was kind of a microcosm of a lot of the things Joe Douglas did wrong as Jets GM. Joe Douglas had a tendency in the NFL draft to fixate on certain prospects and not let the board fall to him. And what I mean by not letting the board fall to him is in any NFL draft, there are lots of great players. So you should not obsess over getting like one particular guy. You can't obsess over one player, because even if that player gets picked by somebody ahead of you, there's going to be another really good player prospect who's going to fall to you. And Douglas had this tendency to trade up. He did it a lot. And what that does, that robs you of late round picks. And I'm not saying you never trade up. And I'm not saying you never trade a late round pick for a veteran player, which Douglas also did a lot. But what I am saying is that teams need to hit on late round picks. And late round picks are low percentage plays. So if you trade away a late round pick on a trade up or for a veteran player, you've got to replenish the well. You've got to reacquire late round picks. And perfectly, let me give you a piece of data that kind of proves my point. The two good late round picks Joe Douglas had in his 6 years as Jets GM were Michael Carter II and Jamie Sherwood, both drafted in 2021, a year where the Jets had 7 picks on day 3. That's not an accident. They had extra picks that year. That's why they hit on those picks. And the other aspect of this was just really faulty scouting. I mean, I don't understand why Corley was the guy Douglas and Saleh were obsessed to get. 2024 was a deep wide receiver class in the draft. And it's one thing to miss on an evaluation. I'm not going to get on them because they whiffed on the Corley evaluation, because anybody can whiff on an evaluation in a big way. But my issue is that in a deep wide receiver class, they obsessed over him. They acted like we have to trade up and get this guy. This was a guy who had like none of the fundamentals at the position down. It really did not make a lot of sense when you look at the big picture. So Jets move on from Corley. I think it's the right move. I think that just because you were drafted high doesn't mean you have a world of upside the way some writers are claiming. I think it's best to just admit a mistake and move on. Again, easier to do it when it's the previous GM's pick. We'll see whether Mucci can do it with his own picks, but I think the Jets made the right decision. Other than that, the defensive tackle room, I was kind of lukewarm on the 2 trades the Jets made last week, but I look at this defensive tackle room now. I like the mix of guys that they've got. I do think that this is an intriguing group. It may not be a great group, but I think it's intriguing. You have the star in Quinnen Williams. You have the proven quality veteran in Harrison Phillips. Maybe not a great player, but a good player. Then you have a couple of young guys with upside. Juwan Briggs, Leonard Taylor, and then Jay Tufele, who's a veteran who hasn't been great in his career, but number 5 defensive tackle, at least looked pretty decent in preseason. Maybe the coaching staff can get more out of him than his previous coaching staffs did. As lukewarm as I was on those trades last week, we go back and listen to the show. I was not super excited. I'm actually kind of intrigued by this defensive tackle room. This Jets roster was not going to be spectacular across the board, but they at least have brought in an interesting mix of players at the defensive tackle spot. I like that Brady Cook was cut. He was a non-drafted free agent signing out of Missouri. The Jets cut Adrian Martinez a couple days before they cut Brady Cook. Those were the 2 guys battling out for the 3rd quarterback spot. The fact they cut Martinez before Cook suggested to some that maybe Cook would stick as the 3rd quarterback. I mean, I just don't think Cook is an NFL quarterback. I don't think he's an NFL talent. And I think that the best move for the Jets is either to keep Martinez on the practice squad as QB3 or look outside the organization. And I think there are a couple of veterans out there who could be interesting options for the Jets at quarterback as the 3rd quarterback who were cut yesterday. We'll talk about them a little bit later on the show. And finally, I like that the Jets focused on special teams in some of their decisions. The last cornerback spot seemed to come down between Quantez Diggers and Jarek Bernard-Converse. And there's no question Converse is a better cover guy right now. But when we were talking about our number 5 corner, you're talking about a guy we hope will never see the field. So the only way your number 5 corner is going to see the field is on special teams. And Stiggers outperformed JBC on special teams. A mild surprise, the Jets keep Zaire Barnes as a linebacker. Barnes has been a guy who's been a core special teamer the last couple of years. And also a guy who went to IR, Jamarcus Weston, who was a UDFA signing out of Florida, mainly for his special teams work. Never really found a role in the Gators offense or defense. He actually went to injured reserve, but there was a report that came out after they put him on IR is that once he's healthy, he's going to be on the 53-man roster because the Jets view him as a core special teamer. And I think for an undermanned team like the Jets, they're going to have to find little advantages within the game. And sometimes, a team that isn't that great roster-wise can steal a game or two based on quality special teams play. And I think the Jets may have set themselves up to do that with some of their roster decisions. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue talking about this 53-man roster. There were some things I did not love about what the Jets did. And as much as I was behind them moving on from Malachi Corley, there were some other wide receiver decisions that left me scratching my head. We'll talk about what they are as we continue here on this this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. The NFL season is right around the corner, and you can feel the buzz. Fantasy football season is here. Everyone's researching and drafting and building their championship squads. If you have not joined a league yet, now's the time, and it's all happening on Yahoo Fantasy. This year, I'm playing fantasy football on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran creating your millionth league. Yahoo Fantasy is loaded with fun ways to compete and brand new features that make the game even better. With the season kickoff on September 4th, now is time to start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football, which offers so many fun ways to compete. Want more ways to play? Try the brand new Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine League mode, where the lowest scoring team gets eliminated weekly until one team is left standing. Want to play instantly with friends? Try the new Draft with Friends mode. Prefer the classics? Get your crew together and go head-to-head in a private league. No crew? No problem. Join a public league, the easiest way to play. The NFL season kicks off September 4th, so don't wait. Start your league now. Draft now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. That's yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. The Jets announced their initial 53-man roster for 2025 yesterday. There were some moves that left me scratching my head. I'm not going to lie about this. And I'll start off by talking about the wide receiver position. And I have to say that this wide receiver room, I don't want to go overboard, but my first thought was this room is a disgrace. The Jets kept 6 receivers. They kept Garrett Wilson, Alan Lazard, Josh Reynolds, Tyler Johnson, Arian Smith, and Xavier Gibson. There is no way an NFL team should have a wide receiver room that looks like this. And as much as I'm going to praise them for moving on from Corley, and by the way, the fact that receiver rooms in this shape shows you how Malachi Corley is not this enormous talent, because there's no way a guy who's an enormous talent, no matter what his issues are, there was no way a guy with enormous upside would fail to make a team with the receiver room in this shape. Now, I'm not criticizing the Jets because the quality is poor, because we talked a lot during the offseason about how the Jets did not have the resources to fix all the problems on the team. So they needed to prioritize. They decided to prioritize the trenches. I agree with that decision, especially with the first round pick going with Armand Membu. I applaud that decision. But let's go back to what I mentioned in the first segment about the defensive tackle room. Is the Jets defensive tackle room spectacular right now? No, but it's intriguing. There are some interesting pieces there. You have, again, the star in Quinnen Williams. You have the quality veteran in Harrison Phillips. You have the couple young guys, Briggs and Taylor. And then you have like the veteran who's been around the league who, fills all the veteran cliches. He knows how to play. He's got his technique down, Jay Tefeli. The wide receiver room right now, you have a star in Garrett Wilson. After that, you have one guy with upside. Arian Smith is the only guy in this group with upside. You have 4 guys in Josh Reynolds, Alan Lazard, Tyler Johnson, and Xavier Gibson, who are bad players who don't help on special teams because, look, Gibson, I know he's a return guy, but he's a bad return guy and don't have upside. And, like Johnson, Lazard, and Reynolds are all 5+ year veterans. Gibson may only be in year 3, but we know he's got no upside. There is no way you can tell me that this is the receiver room the Jets should have. Now, there's a caveat here. I am certain that Xavier Gibson is not going to be on this team opening day. I think the Jets are going to be active on the waiver wire today. I'm assuming they'll bring in a receiver. I'm assuming Gibson will be the guy who goes. But I don't understand how these are the guys you keep. Look, I'm not saying that the guys the Jets cut would have been great. I'm not saying that they would have had a good wide receiver room if they had made different choices, but it would have been more interesting. Like if they keep Brandon Smith's 26. He was kind of like a darling of the preseason. He can play special teams. He can at least help you in that phase of the game. Other positions, it felt like the Jets really valued special teams, not at wide receiver. I mean, could they have kept Quentin Skinner, Jamal Pritchett, UDFAs? You're not expecting much from UDFAs, but at least they're young enough to have upside. You can't have a receiver room where you have one good player and one guy with upside, especially when you're rebuilding. I understand that if you want like one or two veteran stabilizers in there, guys who know how to read coverages, guys who know how to run routes, that's fine. But I mentioned this yesterday. There's no way you could justify keeping Josh Reynolds, Alan Lazard, and Tyler Johnson, all three. And I didn't even think they were going to keep Xavier Gibson. It's one thing to not be good. It's another to offer no special teams value and no upside. And that's what the Jets wide receiver room is right now. And this brings me to another issue that I have. Now, in the first segment, I said, keeping Quantez Diggers over Jarek Bernard-Converse was probably the right decision. But I don't understand, if you're going to keep 6 wide receivers, why you wouldn't just keep Jarek Bernard-Converse as an extra corner. Like, instead of keeping 6 receivers, just keep 5 and keep an extra corner instead. Because wide receiver is not a position of strength for the Jets. So if you're going to have a position of weakness, keep less guys there, because the guys you keep aren't going to help your team. Bernard-Converse had an excellent preseason in 2025 after an excellent preseason in 2024. Now, I'm not saying Jarek Bernard-Converse is a lock to be a high-end corner in this league. In fact, he reminds me a bit of a guy who was on the Jets team about 7 years ago, Derek Jones. He was a late-round pick by Mike McCagnon in 2017 out of Mississippi State. His second year, he had an outstanding preseason in coverage. He was a corner. The Jets cut him, and he never really developed anywhere. Never really caught on anywhere. He was playing well against guys who were backups in the league, practice squatters, and just because he was playing well in preseason did not mean he was going to be a quality player in this league. I kind of have the same feeling about Bernard-Converse. Do I think that Bernard-Converse is going to develop into a starter? Probably not, but I don't know what else he needed to do to make the team, because he was really, really good in the coverage in the preseason. And I don't see why it had to be a choice between Stiggers and Bernard-Converse. Now, if it was a choice, I agree with keeping Stiggers because he's younger. He's got more special teams ability. But based on the preseason Bernard-Converse had, would I rather keep him or Xavier Gibson as my number 6 receiver? I'd rather keep Bernard-Converse, because you at least saw a guy who showed some cover skills. You at least saw a guy who, flashed like he could be a decent player one day. And cornerback is very important in Aaron Glenn's defense. If we're going to have a position where we keep an excess of players based on the current system the Jets are running, I think corner is one of those. It's a very logical place to have an extra guy in reserve, because Aaron Glenn's blitzing defenses are going to require guys who can cover on the back end at the cornerback position. And I don't want to go overboard with the criticism here, because at the end of the day, we're talking about, who was the 53rd best player on the roster versus the 54th best player. But if you were going to keep, if the wide receiver position was so weak that you got to the point of keeping Xavier Gibson, just keep an extra corner instead. There's really no reason to let a guy who at least flashed some potential go, to keep a guy with no potential at wide receiver. The other big issue I had was at the tight end position. And again, this is one I don't want to go crazy about, because I do think Jeremy Ruckert's going to be gone by week 1. I think the Jets will be active on the waiver wire and probably move on from Ruckert at the tight end position. But I don't see what the point of keeping him on the roster was to begin with. Again, you had a chance to keep Bernard-Converse at least temporarily, or figure something out at corner. And there were other guys, the Jets could have kept instead. Ruckert just has not developed, and people have finally, I think, figured that out this preseason. I've seen a lot of articles about how much Ruckert's struggling, how he's not blocking well, how he's not catching the ball. And it feels like people are kind of late to the party on this one, because this is not that different from what Jeremy Ruckert did through his first 3 seasons in the NFL. I think, it's a feel-good story. He was a hometown pick. He was a kid who grew up rooting for the Jets on Long Island. So I think the fan base kind of got behind him for that reason, but he never really developed into a quality tight end, either as a pass catcher or a blocker. And I fully expect the Jets to upgrade the tight end position and move on from Ruckert. But like I said this on yesterday's show, that I would have considered Andrew Beck a tight end. Keep Beck. I mean, I think Beck actually might be the best tight end on the roster, even though a lot of people list him as a fullback. Fullback and tight end are kind of, interchangeable in today's league. You have guys who handle both duties. So I would have kept Beck, Mason Taylor, and Stone Smart and move forward without Ruckert. I think the Jets will correct that today, but it's still not a move I agree with. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about how the Jets may correct some of these positions. There are spots where the Jets are weak, and there are players available on the waiver wire or free agency who could upgrade those positions. Let's discuss who the Jets should be looking at as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL season is almost here, and FanDuel's making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. FanDuel makes every game more exciting, whether you're watching the Jets or just keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. It's quick, easy, and the best way to add a little more energy to Sundays. And not just football, baseball, Yankees and Mets aren't playing very well, but you can get it in on the action on FanDuel. Any sport you want, FanDuel's got you covered. So are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Wednesday, we have the initial Jets 53-man roster for 2025, but it's only initial. The Jets are sure to be making moves between now and week one, and that will begin today when the NFL announces its preliminary set of waiver claims. So the way waivers work are when you cut a player with less than 4 years of NFL experience, they become subject to the waiver process. And that means any of the other 31 teams can say, I want this player, and you get him. You get his full it's like trading for him for nothing because you get his contract with his previous team. And if more than one team claims a player, well, the team with the higher pick in the first round of this year's NFL draft is awarded the player. So the Jets are sitting, in a pretty good spot when it comes to the waiver wire priority. Jets have the 7th highest waiver claim, so there are only 6 teams that can beat the Jets in a waiver claim. So opportunity to find better players. And to answer a question a lot of people have, this does not work like your fantasy league, because in a lot of fantasy football leagues, what happens is once I claim a player, I go to the back of the line and I then have the lowest waiver priority. In the NFL right now, the Jets will have the 7th highest waiver claim priority, whether they claim one player or whether they claim 10. It does not change because the waiver wire is viewed as a mechanism to try and help bad teams improve. So where can the Jets look on the waiver wire? I think the tight end position is the one where, first of all, the Jets are pretty weak after Mason Taylor. But second of all, there are some intriguing players who are hitting the market. One is a guy the Colts let go, Jelani Woods. And Woods has an interesting athletic profile, but he also has an interesting career story because he had a pretty good season in 2022, then missed pretty much 2 full seasons back to back, one because of a hamstring injury, another because of turf toe. Now, I think when you have a guy who's just missed back-to-back seasons because of soft tissue injuries, it's very fair to say that this is a big injury risk, and there's probably an upper limit of what we can actually expect, the number of games we can actually expect him to play. But Woods did look good in preseason this year. And with the Colts, they have a pretty decent tight end room. I mean, it's felt more like a numbers game than at saying anything negative about Woods. I think that, when you're in a situation where the Jets, where really what you have at tight end are a 2nd-round pick in Mason Taylor, a project player in Stone Smart, and a guy who just isn't very good in Jeremy Ruckert. This is the type of guy you should be taking a chance on. And you can throw Andrew Beck into the mix, but would I rather have Jeremy Ruckert or Jelani Woods? I'd rather have Jelani Woods. I'd rather roll the dice with Woods. Maybe he run into a healthy season and he can produce. Another guy I have my eye on at tight end, plays with the Giants. Actually, a very similar backstory. Greg Dulcich. Another guy who had a very good 2022 season with the Denver Broncos, then pretty much missed 2 full years. In 2023, he was injured he had his own hamstring injury. 2024, he wasn't really active. Broncos cut him. He caught on with the Giants, had a decent preseason this year with the Giants. Is this the type of guy you want as a starting tight end? I don't know, but does he have more upside than what the Jets have? I think the answer to that is probably yes. Now, I think the Jets should also be active at the wide receiver position on waivers. Now, the challenge with the wide receiver position is the Jets just cut some UDFAs who look kind of promising. So are there other UDFAs out there that intrigue the Jets more? Maybe. I mean, maybe a guy like Trayshawn Holden in Dallas, who had a pretty good preseason and brings some nuance as a route runner. Now, I think his upside is kind of limited because he's not that athletic. He's not that fast. But it's a guy who maybe could stick on a roster as like a back-end wide receiver. Maybe that's the guy you look at. I'll tell you the one thing I think the Jets should avoid at the wide receiver position, though, and that's bringing in a veteran. And I've heard people suggest all sorts of names. I've heard Marquez Valdez-Scantling. I've heard our old friend Robbie Chosen, who used to be Robbie Anderson, who was cut by San Francisco. I heard Hunter Renfrow, who was cut by Carolina. And I understand those suggestions. And these are players who have enough experience in the league that they are not subject to the waiver process. These are players who, because they have more than 4 years of experience, are just free agents now and can sign with any other team. I think the Jets are set on the the low ceiling veteran receiver. If we're going to keep Lazard and we're going to keep Reynolds and we're going to keep Johnson, we don't really need another veteran in here, especially a veteran who's not really going to provide a lot of upside. You already have more than what you need in terms of like, if you want a veteran presence who's going to be stable and run routes. We've got plenty of that. We don't need that. What we need are young guys with upside. So I would avoid the veteran route. The other name that a couple of people have thrown out, which I don't understand for the life of me, is Deontay Johnson. Yeah, Deontay Johnson's got ability, but the Browns just cut him. He couldn't make the Browns receiver group. And last year he was on 3 teams, the latter 2 of which were playoff teams who cut him during late in the season. Playoff teams who were gearing up for a Super Bowl run, who said, we don't want this guy on the team. Lots of issues with Deontay Johnson. I don't even think the Jets should consider bringing him in. I think the Jets bring somebody in, it should be like the guy I mentioned, somebody of the profile like a Trayshawn Holden, who played well in preseason, who's gotten some positive attributes to his game. Maybe not the greatest ceiling in the world, but at least some upside, which is something the Jets are really lacking at the wide receiver position now. I think the other big question mark is the third quarterback spot. And the third quarterback spot kind of got thrown into chaos with Jordan Travis's retirement, because generally speaking, what you want in a third quarterback is a young developmental guy. You want a guy who you're going to give reps to. It's probably not going to work out, but you're at least trying to catch lightning in a bottle by getting a quarterback, by developing a quarterback. One name I heard thrown around a lot yesterday was Tommy DeVito, who the Giants cut. I would not touch Tommy DeVito. I don't think Tommy DeVito is an upgrade over Adrian Martinez. Now, I know what people are going to say. Well, look what he did in 2023. DeVito started and won 3 games. He had some decent numbers in those games. But I got to tell you, like, if you look at what happened in those games, I think that was a little case of catching lightning in a bottle. I think there were some fluky things that happened in those games. I did not come away like either in the moment or going back now. I did not come away thinking DeVito was more than a practice squad maybe the best number 3 level quarterback. I don't think that he's any better than Adrian Martinez. I think if you're looking to upgrade on Martinez, you go the veteran route. And, a guy that just got cut by Buffalo is a familiar name to Jets fans, Mike White. Mike White's a really good number 3 quarterback. If such a thing exists, that's Mike White, because I think what you want in a number 3 quarterback is a guy who, if you need to play him a game, he can lift your team up. And we know Mike White can do that. We've seen Mike White do that twice with the Jets, where they needed a spark in one game, and he gave it to them. Can't really do much beyond that first game, but that one game, if you need one big game, Mike White can deliver it. Another guy who I feel less passionately about, who I guess could make sense if you're obsessed with the idea that you want your offense to run the same way as under your backup quarterback as you do your starter. I don't think that that's really that big of a deal. But because I think in the NFL, game plans are, in this day and age, game plans are so week to week anyway that lots of things are changing from week to week. So I don't think you need a backup quarterback who runs the same offense as your starter. But if you want that, Tyler Huntley, former Pro Bowler Tyler Huntley, who inexplicably was voted to the Pro Bowl in 2022 when he got a bunch of starts as Baltimore's backup when Lamar Jackson got hurt. Tyler Huntley is now available. He was released. Huntley's not a great thrower. I mean, the value he brings is mainly as a runner. He's a pretty decent runner. So if you're of the mindset we're going to involve the quarterback in the running game a lot with Justin Fields, and we want a backup or a third stringer who's going to be similar, Tyler Huntley might be your guy. I would prefer Mike White if the Jets aren't going to keep Martinez. I think Martinez is the guy, though. I think he showed he was ahead of Brady Cook. So I think the only way Martinez should not be the number 3 guy on the practice squad is if the Jets go out and get a veteran like White or maybe Huntley to try and upgrade their quarterback depth. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.